So it's a real pleasure and honor to be conducting this interview with you today. And the questions we have were formulated by the members of a multidisciplinary group of scholars who are all very interested in human-animal interactions. Some of us are historians, others are veterinarians, some are psychologists and ethologists, so quite a varied group. But all of us are very excited to hear more about your great work.
Okay.
And I'd like to start off by asking a question about the very roots of your research. Where did your interest in investigating the more pro-social aspects of animal behavior, like empathy, come from? Surely there were some empirical theoretical considerations that led you to investigate those topics, but in addition to these, were there also some personal events or factors that led you to study those social propensities among non-human animals?
Yeah, when I was a student, the only topic people could talk about was aggressive behavior, because Konrad Lorenz had written his book on aggression. And all the research on animals was focused on aggression. All the stories about human evolution were on aggression. And I was given the task to study aggressive behavior in chimpanzees. And before that, I had worked on macaques, which are quite aggressive, more aggressive, I would say, than chimpanzees. Then I went to the chimpanzees and I discovered sort of accidentally that they reconcile after fights. So if they have a fight, then 10 minutes later they come together and they kiss and embrace each other. And I thought that was actually more interesting than aggressive behavior, personally. When I first reported that, people didn't know what to do with it, because all the focus was on you need to be competitive, you need to win, you need to be dominant. Aggression is a good thing because it helps you survive and it helps you access resources. And if you then say, well, yeah, you know, but after the fights they reconcile, they didn't know what to do with that. And it was not that they denied the behavior, but they didn't want me to use the term reconciliation. They wanted me to call it post-conflict contact because I was too anthropomorphic, they felt. And most of the people I talked with, most of the scientists said, well, maybe chimpanzees do these things, but my animals would never do it. Now we know, many studies later, that almost all social animals do it. Hyenas, dolphins, elephants, many birds also. Many animals have reconciliation behavior. So that was my interest, became my interest at the time, because everyone was doing aggressive behavior. And I thought, this is more interesting. And so from there, I moved on to empathy. Because in the same context in the chimpanzees, I saw that they would console someone who was distressed. And so these became the topics. And when I moved to the United States, which was in the early 80s, I decided that instead of focusing on competition and aggression, which was what everyone was doing, I was going to focus on the opposite. And so it was partly a career decision because I wanted to do something new, something that no one was doing. And partly because I was much more interested in it. I felt fighting, you know, I'm always a bit disturbed by fighting if it is very serious. It's not something that I like to watch necessarily. And so I watched things that I was more interested in.
Yeah, so there were strategic questions around that choice, but also some personal inclinations about the topic. And yeah, great. Yeah. So we have a set of questions that were formulated by a colleague ethologist. So those questions are really much closer to your research interests. And then we're going to be moving on to questions from more social scientists that are going to be a bit farther from your own research, but I think it's going to be interesting to put all that together. So I was wondering also, he was noting that in cooperative breeds and monogamous species like wolves, dominance is almost exclusively about access to mates, at least in extended family groups, like in multi-generational groups. Now, is it the same in chimpanzees and bonobos, or does the expression of dominance extend to other matters for them, like negotiating territory, for instance?
Yeah. So dominance, usually we look at it in the primates as for females, it's about food, and for males, it's about sex. So a female cannot increase her reproduction by having more mates. She needs to get the best possible mates, but once she is pregnant, she will have one baby, or in some species, maybe two babies, but that's it. And she cannot increase having more sex with more males. And so for the females, it is important when they get pregnant that it is with the right genes, but the next best thing for them is food, because they will need to grow a fetus and they need to make sure that their offspring gets enough food. And so females compete over food, and females can be quite competitive about that. And in some species, they have a very strict hierarchy, which is strictly enforced. The males, food is sort of secondary. For the males, the reproduction is tied to the number of mates that they can fertilize. And so a male can actually increase his reproduction by mating with more females. And so that's why the males compete more over sex. And they compete over status, which is a sort of an intermediate stage, because the high-ranking males have more access to females. And so in chimpanzees, for example, they have very intense competition over status, which we usually explain as that's indirectly also competition over females. That's how they compete over females, by trying to get the highest possible positions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. And as a primatologist, would you agree with Said's, who as an anthropologist, Said's assertion that marmosets and tamarins are the closest primates to the human social system?
Well, no, I would not agree with that. Is it? I know why people would look at marmosets and tamarins, because they are cooperative breeders. And so the male is involved in offspring care more than in, let's say, chimpanzees and bonobos, more than in most primates. And so they have little family units. Gibbons also get close to that, male and female. Together they raise the offspring. And that is indeed is a very important similarity with humans. We have the same kind of family structure that we don't see in chimpanzees and bonobos. But in terms of intelligence and social system in general, I would think we're much closer to chimps and bonobos. So people have made all sorts of comparisons. There was a time in the 60s where everyone looked at baboons, and we were being compared with the baboon because the baboon lived on the savannah, and we humans, or our human ancestors, also entered the savannah. And so everyone said the baboon is the best model. In terms of DNA, in terms of genetics, humans are very close to chimps and bonobos and have the same sort of intelligence, I would say. The family structure is a bit different, but that doesn't make, I think, marmosets and tamarins the most similar species.
Okay, yeah, great, okay. Now we're moving to questions from the social scientists per se. And some of those questions are about your recent TED Talk titled The Surprising Science of Alpha Males, that focuses and also demystifies the notion of dominance about non-human animals. Now, why is the notion of dominance receiving so much research attention at the moment? Do you think it's because of recent scientific advances made about the behavior of primates, or could it be a reflection of our own current human reality and some of the very salient social issues we're confronting as humanity?
Yeah, I think in primatology and in animal behavior in general, the study of dominance has actually declined, I would say. It used to be a big topic in the 70s and 80s and so on. But also had its limitations, because clearly, if you look at a primate group, you see sort of two dimensions. One is what I call the vertical dimension, which is from top to bottom, which is the hierarchy. The other one is the horizontal, which is the networking, who is close to whom. And actually, at the moment, I think people are more interested in the networking and the kinship and the friendship relationships than in the hierarchical relationships. But in human studies, yes, dominance is a sort of, and usually it's translated as leadership. What do we need to be leader? And people are very obsessed by being good leaders, and all our children need to become leaders somehow. We're very obsessed by that. And so people are focusing on that. And then that's where the idea of alpha male and alpha female comes from, in the sense that everyone wants to be an alpha male. And alpha male is usually used in that literature, the business literature, as equivalent to being a bully and being dominant over everybody, and more like a personality characteristic. And so that means is, do I have the right personality characteristics to be a leader? And leadership is very narrowly defined in that literature. So there's an obsession with dominance in there, and they extract things from the primate literature which pleases them, and they forget all the rest that we know about alpha males and alpha females. But I feel that dominance is a bit overrated, and I'm more interested actually in cooperation than in dominance. But yeah, that's the focus at the moment.
Yeah, great. Okay, yeah. And I personally found that your TED Talk offered a very nuanced view about the expression of dominance among animals, which involves a lot of pro-sociality and a great sense of responsibility as well. So in this sense, the TED Talk could possibly lead us to question a very stereotyped view of animals' dominance as involving aggressivity, impulsivity, and even perhaps selfishness. And in that context, what do you think the stereotypes that humans have of animals, that they can be aggressive and impulsive, for instance, what did they tell us about humans per se?
Yeah, humans use the animal kingdom usually for the bad characteristics of themselves, not for the good ones. So they will say, well, in nature, the dominant gets everything, and so I want to be the dominant, and I want to be like an alpha male. And if humans kill each other, they call them animals, and so we project all these negative things on the animals. And if we do good things, if we help each other and we're nice and we're altruistic, then we claim that for ourselves. That's typically human, and that's called humane behavior. And so the human characteristics are noble and the animal characteristics are base. But I think all our characteristics, the good ones and the bad ones, they are related to primate behavior. They're related to our primate psychology. And we can find examples of both of them in primate behavior. And I always feel that when humans are good and nice, they are better than most primates. But if we are nasty and mean, we're actually worse than most primates, because we can be nastier than they ever are. And so I think that comparison is very limited. And also nature is very often used by humans to justify things that they do. So for example, for the longest time, conservatives, in political conservatives, have used nature as an example that we need competition in society. We need a capitalist system in which we all compete because look at nature. That's how nature works. So they use nature to justify a purely competitive, unregulated competitive system, which I think is also wrong. Nature can also give you completely different examples of high levels of cooperation, but they pick the competition as their example.
So do you believe that your work contributes to demystifying that, and it contributes also to decreasing the stereotypes of animals and to bring some more balance into what are our actual roots and what links us to non-human animals?
Yeah, that's partly my goal. My goal is to bring animals a little bit up in our estimation and humans a little bit down in our estimation, because we think we are completely rational, cognitive beings, which we really aren't. And we have a very stereotypical view of how nature operates. I'm at the moment writing about gender, and in gender relations, that's the same thing, that people have the image of the natural world that in primates that the male is boss and the females have to obey. That's true for some species. There are some species where you can see that. But in most species, that's not true at all. It's not that simple. But that's how people want to look at things. Yeah.
And where do you think that this motive to perceive humans as superior to other animals, where do you think what's the root of that in your opinion?
Well, that goes back a long time. Most people give it a religious origin, like we have a soul and animals don't have souls, but it actually goes back further. I think the old Greeks already had the same sort of views before we had the Christian religion. And so in the West, that's a very old idea, is that we humans we're different from nature, actually. And I think if you look at academic disciplines like psychology, anthropology, philosophy, in all these disciplines, not in medicine or biology, where we look at humans as biological beings, but in all the humanities, there is a very strong denial that humans are animals. This is changing in psychology, because psychology is being flooded now by neuroscience, and the neuroscientists, of course, they know that the brain of the rat and the brain of the human are operating in very similar ways. So in psychology, the attitude is changing, but in most of academia, we have humans, and then a long nothing, and then we have animals. And this attitude has given us a lot of trouble. At the moment, the climate change, at the moment, the pandemic, the virus situation teaches us that we are part of the natural system. We are part of the natural world. And if we violate the rules of the game, we're going to get in trouble. And so I always think that it's a major flaw of Western philosophy that it has put humans on a pedestal. And it has created it's now creating a lot of trouble. And maybe we're going to learn a little bit from that trouble.
Yeah, and going more deeply into those similarities that can exist between animals and humans, it seems like the humanities and social science are increasingly seeking to demonstrate, sometimes to the point of anthropomorphism, some of the similarities that exist between animal behaviors and human behaviors and emotions. So it's trending in that direction as well, while those very deep historical and philosophical conceptions still exist. There is emerging research along those lines. But do you think that we can still defend specificities that are unique to humanity in this view still?
What kind of is humanity? What?
Yeah, so do you think that there are still aspects that are very unique to humans?
Yeah, I think humans are animals for sure, and we're primates, and we're sort of special primates because we have language. I think language is the one characteristic that I feel is typically human and uniquely human. Even though we can find aspects of language in other species, we never find the whole thing of learned symbolic communication. So language is special, and it's fine to be proud of that. You know, the trunk of an elephant is also very special, and it's fine for the elephant to be proud of it. So yeah, we have something special. I don't think that is sufficient to argue that humans are a separate being.
Yeah.
And you say that more and more the scientists now look at humans as part of the animal kingdom. This is maybe true in some circles, but the anthropologists still have meetings regularly about how special humans are. They have meetings about what makes humans so successful, what makes humans so special and so unique. They call it the distinctiveness of humans, or it's a sort of exceptionalism of our species. And so in some disciplines, there is still a very strong feeling that humans are something else. And if you then explain that the transition from our ape ancestors to us has been extremely gradual, and there's many species in between, but there's certainly not a mysterious jump in between, they really don't want to hear that. They want to see humans as special. And so even when humans are compared with Neanderthals, which are very close to us. It's almost like the same, well, some people put them now in the same genus as humans. Even with the Neanderthals, they feel they need to insist that humans were really, really different. So I face that problem when I talk about chimpanzees and bonobos, which are our closest living relatives. But even towards Neanderthals who are extinct, that same feeling exists.
Focusing now on the shared emotions between animals and humans. So beyond basic emotions like joy, sadness, and anger, how can we prove that human emotion can be found in other animals? For instance, can faceless emotions be measured in animals by focusing on their body posture, for example?
Yeah, the emotions are always expressed in the body. So I make a distinction between feelings and emotions. And the feelings are private states where you become conscious of your emotions. And feelings I cannot know in animals. And so people sometimes use that as an argument, as they say, you cannot study emotions in animals because you don't know what they feel. I have that same problem actually with humans. I don't know what you feel. You can tell me what you feel and that you feel sad, but I have no way of knowing what your sadness is like. And so with humans, I have that same problem, but with animals for sure. We have no access to the feelings, but the emotions are always expressed in the body. Emotions expressed in the face, in the voice, in the blood pressure, the heart rate. The temperature, the emotions are always expressed in the body, and that's what we can measure. We can measure them in the brain, and we can measure them in the body. And so the study of emotions is really not problematic, in my opinion. You just name these bodily manifestations and you give them names related to what you call emotions. And so dependent on the context, you name them. So for example, if a certain bodily state occurs when animals see a predator, you call it fear, because that seems to be the most typical condition in which they will be. Or if they attack each other, you call it anger. So you can use these emotional terminologies dependent on the context in which these things are expressed.
Okay. Yeah, great. Yeah. And I had a couple of questions specifically about the notion of identification that you covered in your book, The Age of Empathy. Because I myself, I'm a social psychologist interested in identity and intergroup relations. And recently we've been investigating the notion of identification with animals. So finding that humans, it's research conducted directly with humans, so humans can identify with animals, but in different ways as well. And then alluding a bit to what you were saying earlier, you were saying people tend to forget that we're animals, right? So we tend to forget about this social identity, this social affiliation, and this biological taxonomy. And so that's probably due to this kind of distancing and superiority that humans have carried around throughout history. Do you think that's the cause here as well?
Is that we have trouble identifying with certain animals, you mean, or with animals in general?
Yeah, well, our work was on identification with animals in general, as a very broad social identity that basically includes human and non-human animals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think humans have, the more distant the animal, the more trouble they have identifying. And so if you talk about pain in fish, for example, people are sort of surprised. Why would we care about pain in fish? The fish don't scream, which makes it easier to ignore their pain, of course. But when animals are distant, we have more trouble with that. And when animals are very close to us, like the primates, we recognize the emotions much more easily, and we identify much more easily with them. And so that's always a problem, is that humans are very biased in how they look at animals, because we are most interested in mammals, really, more than in any other group of animals. And so that's why it's really interesting to look at animals that are totally alien to us, like let's say the octopus. And now people identify with the octopus to some degree because they have seen many documentaries showing how smart these animals are. but we still have trouble with that, of course.
Yeah. So do you feel like phylogenetic similarity would be driving the identification process, or it could even be perhaps just general familiarity, for instance, the pets that we have at home that we can relate to and that we know better as well than other types of animals?
Yeah. In the studies of empathy, both in humans and other species, we find that empathy is driven by familiarity and similarity. So if people that you know well, your own children, so to speak, or your family members, you have more empathy for them because you know them very well. And similarity helps also. So same age, same sex, same race. And that's why we have trouble having empathy for individuals who are quite distant from us or look very different from ourselves. And so similarity and familiarity, and that also means that pets like our dogs and cats automatically get more sympathy from us than let's say pigs or cows. And so we are very biased in that regard.
And going back to your book, you were talking about the notion of identification in relation to empathy, stating, for instance, that empathy's chief portal is identification, but also mentioning that identification could have concrete repercussion. And there's one of the passage in your book, a quote that I really, really find so interesting when you say that if part of the other resides within us, if we feel one with the other, then improving their life automatically resonates with us. And so in that sense, what would be the consequences, the concrete and social consequences of developing this very broad sense of identification? And do you think it's particularly needed in today's society? You were alluding to also the pandemic and the need to reconceive the place of humans. So what do you feel are the most important consequences of this broad identification?
Yeah, but we think that actually there was an experiment on rats that was done in Chicago where one rat is contained in a container, is locked up, and the other rat learns how to open the container. What they found is that the rats respond to the distress of the one who's locked up, open up the container. They're very highly motivated. They will even do it more often with a trapped rat than with food. So they're more interested in opening it for a trapped rat than for food. And so they're very highly motivated. And the thinking behind that kind of behavior is that if I get distressed because you are distressed, let's say I notice your distress or you're crying or whatever, and this distresses me, then for me to help you and relieve your distress is also good for myself because it relieves my distress also. So it is self-rewarding. And self-rewarding is interesting because people have always had the discussions about, is altruism really altruistic or is it selfish? And I've always felt that that's a nonsense discussion because everything in nature that we need to do is self-rewarding. You need to eat, so eating is self-rewarding. You need to nurse your babies, so nursing is self-rewarding. You need to have sex to reproduce, so sex is self-rewarding. And you need to help each other in a society, and so helping is self-rewarding. And so this whole discussion about what is altruistic and isn't it a little bit selfish is in my opinion, a nonsense discussion because nature has made everything that we need to do self-rewarding to some degree. And so I think identification has consequences. When you identify with others and adopt their feelings in yourself, you automatically are a little bit invested in their situation. And that may mean that you help them, although I think you also go through a calculation in your head. You go through some sort of calculation, can I afford to help them? How much is it going to cost me? Do I have time to help them? Do I have the money to help them? There's an interesting experiment that was done on humans on a campus. It's called the Good Samaritan experiment. What they do is they put a human body, a live student, on the ground, and he acts as if he's sick and in pain. And then they see if people are willing to stop and help him. And the more hurry you give the people, if you tell these people, you need to hurry over there, and you need to give a lecture very soon, the more hurry you give them, the less time they have for this person. And so even though they give a lecture on the Good Samaritan, they have no time to act like the Good Samaritan. It's a very interesting experiment. And it shows that we are responsive to the distress of others, but there's also a calculation like, can we afford to do this, and how much is it going to cost me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess the last question we would have also touches on those concrete behaviors we can have towards other animals, and what kind of actions to undertake, because this emerging research is finding that when we recognize similarities that exist between animals and humans, and when we identify with animals, this is typically associated with more pro-social behaviors and attitudes towards animals, greater moral concerns towards them. And in parallel to those scientific findings, we also find a growing social movement that favors the positive treatment of other animals. So people can adhere to that movement in very different ways, by either changing their own individual daily habits, but also in engaging in larger scale and coordinated social action. So there's different ways to act on behalf of other animals. And what are your attitudes towards those different forms of actions that favor a positive treatment of animals? What's the best course of action, in other words, to bring about positive social change? And what would be the role of science in this process?
You mean changing attitudes towards animals?
Yeah, for instance, yeah, so that it trickles down to a change in behavior towards them too.
Yeah. Well, I do think that we are at a point where we really need to think about agriculture. That's where billions of animals are. So people always list the zoos as a big problem, because in the US, for example, every year 150 million people go to zoos. Maybe not this year, because this year is a strange year, but normally lots of people go to zoos. And then there's a lot of action about it. But if you visit a zoo, and then you visit a pig farm, a big pig farm, you will notice that the zoo is a paradise compared to that. So I think the zoos are a minor problem, and there are much fewer animals there than in agriculture. That's where the big problem is, the billions and billions of animals in there, and we don't treat them well. And I think we are at a point where we need to start thinking about that a bit more, where we need to start thinking what we eat and how we eat it and how we raise these animals. Do we still need to eat them? Are there alternatives to eating animals? And so we need to start rethinking that whole issue. And maybe we should not eat animals unless we can give them a decent life, at least till the point that we eat them, but not the way we're doing now. And so, yes, I think that the attitudes need to change. The attitudes to research on animals also needs to change. How we treat those animals, even though that is much more regulated. I think research is more regulated than agriculture, actually. So yeah, I think the attitudes need to change. And we also have, of course, the wild animals. So we have animals in our care where we have immediate responsibility over them. But there's also animals who are out there in the wild, and we are encroaching on their environment. We're removing forests and so on. And that's another issue, is that we should not be going on like this. That is basically a human population pressure issue. We have so many people in the world that we need space. And so that's a very different problem, in the sense that the only solution to that problem is to have a smaller human population.
Yeah. So that's a whole different set of actions to implement to target that as well. But yeah, well, that pretty much sums the list of questions that we had. It's really interesting to hear you about all those issues and aspects. It's been really great hearing you about it all.
Thank you.